Tune in weekly and listen to the Collateral Damage podcast, where Michael Wilson and Maureen Cavanaugh host a variety of special guests to discuss topics and available services that will help you learn about the impact that substance use has on our lives, our families, and on our communities nationwide. Episodes and listening information can be found at www.cdpodcast.com. You can also search for Collateral Damage Podcast on your favorite listening platforms or watch previous and future episodes on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe and share. All right, welcome everybody to another episode of Collateral Damage. This is Mike Wilson. I'm here with my co-host Maureen Cavanaugh, and today we have a special guest, Travis Lupick. And you are the author of Fighting for Space. You are a staff reporter at the Georgia Strait. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In Vancouver. And you have quite a lot to say about this topic, and I guess I'd like to give our listeners an opportunity to hear kind of what led you to this and what has you out there making so much noise and saying so much about this topic.
Well, you mentioned I'm a staff reporter at the Georgia Strait newspaper in Vancouver. That's a weekly print publication, and I'm a general assignment writer there. I mostly write about politics, or historically I've mostly written about politics, but really we'll write about whatever they need. Mm-hmm. And in 2014, I guess, really, I found myself writing more and more about overdose deaths. And then following year, more and more about something called fentanyl, which we didn't really know a lot about at that time. And as time progressed, I was writing more and more about overdoses, more and more about fentanyl. My editors at the Strait were really generous with my staff time and letting me devote more and more attention to that topic. And as the deaths in Vancouver and British Columbia just went up and up and up, I somewhat organically found that topic eventually pretty much took over my entire job.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, the death toll is staggering. You know, I mean, it's hard not to write about that and to investigate it and to identify the fact that it's a really significant problem.
Yeah, a little background for an American audience. The severity of the overdose crisis in Vancouver is about on par with, say, Philadelphia. By which I mean it's about as bad as it can get.
Wow.
A quote unquote normal number of overdoses across the province of British Columbia is about 200 a year, mm-hmm. and we're up at over 1,500 a year. So wow. 7-8 times above what was once considered quote unquote normal, and that's where we've been for more than a couple of years now.
Wow. How difficult is it to get help in Vancouver if you want it?
It's difficult.
Okay.
Vancouver pats itself on the back for a lot of different things it does right with drug policy. Of course, I'm primarily talking about harm reduction. In 2003, Vancouver opened North America's first sanctioned supervised injection facility, Insite. Mm-hmm. And we've long led the way on low barrier needle exchange and that sort of thing. But we have not been great with mental health care, and we have not been great with treatment for addiction, especially treatment on demand. Our system is siloed, separated across different ministries, different departments, and it is very difficult to find a treatment bed when one needs one.
Wow. And yeah, I mean, that first safe injection site, I've actually heard good things about that. I mean, it's still open, correct?
Still open, yes.
Okay.
This is the primary subject of my book, Fighting for Space: How a Group of Drug Users Transformed One City Struggle with Addiction. Mm-hmm. I recount how there's actually a group of drug users themselves, a Vancouver area network of drug users, sort of formed a union in the late 1990s, and then unofficially partnered with a nonprofit housing provider called the Portland Hotel Society. And through activism, through applying pressure through government, through building a wide coalition of allies, mothers of children who had died of a drug overdose, we established that first supervised injection site in 2003, and it's still there in the same location, 139 East Hastings.
That's great.
And I should emphasize, since 2003, not one overdose death ever.
Wow. Well, I mean, that is the point, right? I mean, it's we have this, kind of a saying down here, which is that you can't help them if they're not alive. You know,
exactly.
There's a lot of people that are pushing up against, and I mean, I've even seen certain chiefs of police say, we're not going to use Narcan, just let them die. You know, I've seen people push up against it. Like, why are we promoting this? Why are we giving them a safe place to do drugs? And I I get what they're saying, but at the same time, like, how can you help them if they're not there? Like, these people are sick, they need our help. And, these are the services that are keeping people alive. These are the grassroots organizations that step in and make policy change and create new options for people. And I love it.
Yeah, you can't get into treatment if you're dead. And what Insite does is keep people alive. It also functions as directly as a doorway to treatment. That is not Insite's primary function, and treatment is never pushed on clients of Insite. They don't hand pamphlets. I don't even believe they have pamphlets displayed for treatment, recovery, that sort of thing. But there are nurses, there are social workers there, and if you ask for, if you enter a conversation about treatment, then they can definitely help connect. So a lot of people find treatment through the supervised injection facility. It's kind of a lesser story about Insite that I don't think's been told loudly enough.
It's so important too, because I think a lot of people don't understand that. That's very often what happens, is that people go in for one reason and wind up finding another reason to, another purpose of it.
Exactly, and let's paint a sort of either or a before and after picture. This person who struggled with a heroin addiction perhaps for years is going to inject drugs on that given day. They can do so in an alley using puddle water, and maybe with the supervision of a drug dealer or a friend. Certainly not a healthcare professional, or they can inject those drugs inside Insite, where it's a registered nurse looking over their shoulder who knows all sorts of has all sorts of information about treatment, recovery, detox, if that's what that client wants.
I recently started to go to a local coalition meeting because I had just moved, so I was trying out the local coalition to see whether they would allow me to stay once I started talking. But that was a big point of concern, is that they were talking about how they were going to write a strongly worded email to somebody who was running for office because he was in support of safe injection sites. So, I mentioned your book. I mentioned no one ever died in a safe injection site. Blah, blah, and they were. I haven't heard when the next meeting is. I think they took me off the list. But I do think that that's a very important concept that people don't get. I think people think that there's going to be people wandering by and will want to, maybe try heroin for the first time. Like
it's a storefront, and they get to watch.
That I really do. I as crazy as that sounds to us, I think that they think that, it's when they used to give out condoms, it's going to make people want to have sex. Because they didn't want to have sex before they had a condom,
And I do get the hostility, the resistance to supervised injection. I really do. Is it enabling? Are you promoting drug use? But if you visit Insite, it's just not a fun place. This is not heroin chic. This is not William Burroughs. There's nothing cool about having to give your name to somebody at a front desk behind a computer and then sit down at a cold metal booth, surrounded by other people, many struggling with health issues, and inject this drug, engage in this very, very private, very intimate, for some people, shameful activity with all these people around you. The people who inject drugs at Insite are not there having a good time. They're there maintaining an addiction that they've struggled with for many years usually. They're just trying to do it in the safest environment possible. So I think if you think Insite's promoting drug use, actually visit the place. It's not that cool.
Well, I think the uninformed probably see it as a social lounge, with some leather chairs and, a nice safe place to inject and then hang out and just kind of hang out with your buddies. Like, I imagine they're uneducated, uninformed, not looking into it. But this is built off of an existing model similar to the one that was started out in Portugal, correct? The harm reduction
Portugal,
model?
but Nordic states primarily was what the Insite's founders were looking at in the early 1990s.
Okay.
Insite's been there since 2003, but these sites have operated in Europe in various different ways for much longer. And I should mention, some of them actually are more comfortable. The government of British Columbia essentially forced a medicalized, sterile model on Insite's founders, the Portland Hotel Society and the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. But there are some supervised injection sites operating in Europe that have taken a more comfortable approach, perhaps more similar to marijuana consumption spaces in Europe. In Amsterdam, for example, more like cafes.
Well, that aligns with the decriminalization, right? Like they
Exactly.
actually they took another step that most places haven't, that allows for those things to take place, right?
Exactly. And I've argued in favor of both models.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Insite, it's functional that Insite is not cool.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, it's not heroin chic, it's not William Burroughs.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it may be a more radical opinion, but why not? If we really want to drop stigma around drug use, if we really want to essentially end stigma, then I think we have to increasingly normalize it. We'd have to be careful how we do that. But if you fully believe that drug users deserve all the rights of anybody who consumes alcohol, for example, then I see valid arguments for more comfortable consumption spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that would be that's actually the battle I hear all the time. I mean, I'm a big fan of the idea of decriminalizing and treating like a public health issue. And what I always bump into is the folks that when we start talking about decriminalizing or legalizing or anything along those lines, people get into, so you're going to provide it for them, you're going to make it comfortable for them, why are we doing this? Why are we normalizing it? It's supposed to be wrong. It's why it's illegal. Very prohibition stance of, if it's not here, people won't look for it, people won't use it. And I mean, there's I'm sure there's good points on each side of that, but I happen to land on the side where decriminalization and treating it like a public health issue makes the most sense. But we have a pretty big country to try to change down here, and that's going to take a really long time.
I'm increasingly, since the publication of Fighting for Space, I answer this question with American audiences a lot. How do we get a safe injection site in our state? Mm-hmm. And I'm increasingly not pessimistic, but I'm cautious with my answer, because in many ways the governments of the United States function more as a continent than a country. There's so much power at the state level.
Yep.
So the fight for Insite that was fought in Canada through the late 90s, 2000s is going to have to be fought 50 times in the United States. Yeah. This is going to be a long struggle. And another point I emphasize is that the fight, Vancouver pats itself on the back today, but that's not how this thing started.
I bet.
The fight for Insite was long. I mean, it was 2 decades. And then even after Insite was established in 2003 in Vancouver, the federal government took it to the Supreme Court of Canada. And there was another almost decade-long fight after Insite was established. Yeah. So this is going to be a long conversation.
With all that's been done, how many people do you think on a daily basis use the facility?
Oh, I wish I had those numbers in front of me. It's hundreds, I know for
hundreds?
Sure. And for a long time, from 2003 to 2016, Insite was the only supervised injection site in Canada. Then we had a change of government, and the new federal government changed regulations to make it more, streamline the application and process. And so from 2003 to 2016, Canada had one supervised injection site. Since 2016, we've now opened dozens of them across the country. Still not one death at any of these facilities. Thousands and thousands of visits every single day. In Vancouver alone, there's, I believe, half a dozen supervised injection facilities opening now. Hundreds and hundreds of overdoses every year, especially since fentanyl arrived. And again, never one death at any of these locations.
So there's thousands of people that potentially could have passed away.
Absolutely. I mean, they do track very carefully overdose reversal numbers. Wow. And overdose reversal numbers, even including naloxone versus that don't include naloxone. They track all this stuff very closely, and it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, collectively thousands of overdose reversals, by which we mean lives saved at these facilities.
That's amazing, because I know firsthand what happens when someone is, and I know that people get tired of this. They think, well, you're going to reverse hundreds of overdoses, and then they keep overdosing, and now they're going to the safe injection site and they're getting revived in overdoses and after overdosing. But I know personally what happens after somebody has maybe been revived 20 times. Sometimes that they wind up turning their whole lives around and going on to, do wonderful things. So this is what we have to keep in mind, that at some point it often stops for people. They just need that time and support.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, sometimes it takes that 15th overdose, and if that's what it takes, then let's get that individual to that 15th overdose, and that's what these injection sites do.
Right.
Well, I mean, you talked about us in here in the United States. If we were to try to go down this road, we'd have to fight 50 battles, and we'd probably have to fight 51 or 52, because there's the state, and then there's the federal, and then there's the
Right.
then there's the Supreme Court, because we'd get hit with that too. That people would fight this to the end. But the as far as the service itself, I mean, just the simple fact that any injection site can say that they've kept hundreds of people alive, on a daily basis, or given hundreds of people access to a safe place to do something they were going to do in a dangerous way anyway. And if even one of those people goes on to get well, it's a success.
Yep, absolutely.
And that in itself speaks volume.
And that's a huge piece of the Insite story. I live in Vancouver's downtown east side, where Insite is located, and I bump into people all the time through my work as a journalist there who have stories about finding abstinence through Insite.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a facility, a much lesser known facility called Onsite, which occupies the floor directly above Insite, and it doesn't have a lot of beds there. It's a recovery facility, and it only has a couple dozen beds, but when they're open, you can be inside the injection room at Insite and begin a conversation about treatment, and then they'll take you right upstairs.
It's amazing.
And you can begin that journey to recovery right there in the same building, and a lot of people have.
And that's that same European model that we were talking about earlier. That I believe they have that layered same approach, where there's the injection site downstairs, and they use heroin instead of they actually give doses out. Correct, in Europe.
In some locations.
In some locations, yeah. You're not. Insite does not do that, right? They just
Insite does not provide drugs.
Okay, so they're not providing any MAT, medication assisted treatment, on the first floor.
No, they don't. No,
okay.
They don't offer any of those drugs. They can definitely connect you.
Okay.
And over the last couple of years, there's an increasing number of locations in the area who actually do offer clean drugs. There's been a prescription heroin diacetylmorphine program that operates on a very not quite experimental, but almost experimental basis. About 100 patients receive prescription heroin in Vancouver now. Wow. And about 200 patients at various locations now receive hydromorphone, a brand name Dilaudid in the United States, as a clean alternative to street drugs.
Interesting. I'd be curious to see what the results are.
This is what I describe as Vancouver's next step in harm reduction. It's primarily a response directly to fentanyl. It's the government recognizing people are always going to use drugs, and Vancouver, British Columbia, North America's drug supply is so increasingly polluted with fentanyl, and so many people are dying that we need to begin experimenting at least with clean supply, and that's what's happening in Vancouver. So there's about 300 people now in Vancouver either receiving prescription heroin or injection Dilaudid from the government on the government dime.
Wow, that's huge. That's a huge response right there. I mean, I've always struggled to. It was never about not being able to accept or agree with harm reduction. It was like, as a person in recovery, I know that, and I know this is something that people are struggling with this concept now, but for me, it was the desperation that addiction caused in my life, and it was the pain that it caused that led me to seek out recovery in the first place. And, one of the things I struggled with early on was that if we took away that desperation, in recovery we call it the gift of desperation. If we take away that desperation, then people don't actively pursue a true recovery path. They get more complacent just treating the symptoms of it, and they stop trying to fight for that real internal change that's necessary to get well. And that was always the battle I had for years. And I think the overdose epidemic, if you will, like the fact that people are dying more and more, and that we're losing people, it did shift my perspective a little bit. That even though that doesn't equate recovery, like being on a medication to treat the symptoms is not the same as being in recovery. It does keep people alive, and it creates a pathway for them to ultimately get to that place. But it was just hard for me to reconcile initially.
It was hard for me too. And I'll tell you how I changed my mind on safe supply, clean supply, and what's essentially a mini legalization model, right? Supplying drugs via the government. In 2012, I think maybe it was 2013, I did a story for Al Jazeera. The time was an American outlet since collapsed, but I did a story about harm reduction in Vancouver. And I, for researching that story, I spent a lot of time at Crosstown Clinic, which is the home of that prescription heroin program that I mentioned. And I was really blown away by what I saw, the changes in clients' lives that had occurred there. And then I continued to do stories about that group, that prescription heroin, those prescription heroin users, meeting them, checking in with them every 6 months or so for the next 3, 4, 5 years now. Wow. And the changes that I've seen in these individuals' lives are just so remarkable. Most of them are still on heroin, but most of them are at significantly smaller doses. All of them are in stable housing. I would say plus 90% of the men no longer commit any sort of crime beyond perhaps a little illicit drug use on the side. One of my favorite changes, or my favorite change, is in Crosstown Clinic's female client population. But plus 90% of them were engaged in sex work before entering this program, and that percentage number is now 0.
Wow, that's huge. I mean that's life-changing.
That won me over, that statistic alone. When you strip away the illegal classification of this drug, so many other harms begin to fall away. Homelessness, fear of persecution, criminal activity, all that sort of thing. And after a couple years in this program, a lot of its members rejoin the workforce. And for the first time, they're contributing to the illegitimate economy. I shared a lot of the attitudes that you said you once did towards these sorts of programs. I was highly skeptical, and it was getting to know this group of really, really amazing people and how their lives changed in this prescription heroin program over several years that won me over.
It's amazing when we just leave our judgment aside and look at things with empathy and compassion, the difference that makes.
And let's just look at, what are we ultimately trying to achieve here? If it's improved health outcomes, if it's stable housing, if it's less criminality, the Crosstown Clinic and its prescription heroin program achieves all of these things. And there are Crosstown Clinic patients who have found abstinence. After all of those stressors are removed, people find that there is less reason to do drugs. And voluntarily, because Crosstown Clinic does not push abstinence in any way, it really leaves each client's life in their own control. But through this program and through stripping away stresses of homelessness, criminality, all that, there are Crosstown patient clinics who have access to free pharmaceutical-grade heroin who have chosen to stop using it.
Well, I mean, if I go back to my own days of active use, I mean, I didn't necessarily have a drug problem. I had an access to drug problem. I mean, that my entire criminal history is based on the fact that I did those things because I needed money, because I needed drugs. I was in any of the domestic situations or any of the arguments I had or any of the real problems that I had, my homelessness, everything was, you could bring it right back to my substance abuse issues and my pursuit of money or my pursuit of substances. And
Crosstown Clinic. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say that if to your point, like if the true goal of harm reduction is to limit the damage one's doing to oneself, as well as the community and society that they live in and their family system and everybody that they directly impact, then yes, that service would work.
I think Crosstown Clinic is I had heard the idea, it's not drugs that do the most harm, but the laws that make them illegal that do the most harm. And it was inside Crosstown Clinic and getting to know the patients there where I saw that with my own eyes in the most literal sense. It was not the drugs that were hurting these people the most. It was the laws that make them illegal.
Well, that's that prohibitionism. I mean, we have that down here, and I think every president in the last 50 years has implemented it in some way and has said they were going to do it differently, but just ended up doing it the same way. It's this big war on drugs. Let's fight the access. Let's make sure people don't have it as though that's the solution. And it's definitely not, because otherwise we would have won it by now with the tens of billions of dollars that have been spent. But
right. Throwing people into jail, which reminds me, I was just reading through your articles and I reread the article that you did with Jess Tilley about this time last year about the groups of people that were signing on to almost like a do not resuscitate, but it was a do not prosecute. Have you heard of this, Mike?
I have not.
So Jess Tilley is one of, she's in the head, I think she's the head of the Drug Users Union out in Western Mass.
I want to say she was on that show
prominent.
with you and I, wasn't she, Maureen?
Yes, she was. That's right.
The
Yeah.
BUR, yeah.
Yeah. So last
Leading
year,
drug user out of Massachusetts, she established the New England Drug Users Union. Remarkable woman. Remarkable.
yeah, really pretty incredible. But why don't you talk about the article instead of me talking about it, because you did a better job than I will.
Well, this all concerns something called a drug-induced homicide charge or a death by distribution law. It's a tool that has been around for a long time, but was never really used. But since fentanyl, prosecutors across the United States are increasingly charging quote-unquote dealers with these new laws, saying you're not only guilty of dealing drugs, you're guilty of murder, manslaughter, homicide, that sort of thing. Now that will probably sound good to a lot of people in theory. Drug dealers prey on people, and we want to hit them with everything we can. But how the law is actually used, which has been observed over the past 5 years as it's used more and more in a number of states, is that it's not charging quote unquote drug dealers. It's friends, family, girlfriends,
Like 50%,
spouses who are hit with this law. Yeah. I mean, we don't have reliable statistics because it's state by state, but plus 50%, it sounds like a ballpark to me. So it's to really make it crystal clear, here's this sort of situation where these laws are often applied. A man goes out, leaves his girlfriend at home. They're both addicted to heroin, have been for years, and he picks up a couple points from their dealer. He comes home. This couple injects in bed together, and they go to sleep. And this man wakes up in the morning, and his girlfriend does not. Is this man a drug dealer? I would argue he's not, but he is the kind of individual against which these laws are actively applied. And now, not only did this man lose his girlfriend, the love of his life, but he has to sit in jail for the rest of his life for her death.
Wow. So
what Jess Tilley and Louise Vincent in North Carolina, what this pair of women has been doing, is promoting this idea called the Do Not Prosecute order, which says, again, kind of like it says, if I die of a drug overdose, do not convict my dealer for my death, essentially.
Wow.
It's drug users saying, I do not want, my friends, my family, my loved one, charged in my name. I did this drug on my own accord. This was my choice. Don't charge my dealer. Many of which are not even dealers.
Right. I mean, I always fear any type of a blanket response in one way or the other, because there are both. There are actually dealers out there who are maliciously putting drugs in bags and maybe should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law based on their malicious acts. And then there are those other people, like you said, on the other end of the spectrum that are friends and family members who, as an active addict, I know what it was like when I was out there, that we all just helped each other out, which meant that on any given day I could have been considered a dealer. And
we actually want people helping each other out. Especially since fentanyl, we do not want drug users using alone. That's the number one rule of heroin use in 2019. Do not use alone, because you always want someone there to catch you if you overdose.
Right.
But what drug-induced homicide laws do is promote drug use alone, because they create the risk that if you're in a pair, your partner is going to be charged.
Right.
So, these laws just accomplish the absolute opposite of their intention. They're not saving people from drug use. They're causing overdose deaths.
Well, I think it's a scare tactic, to try to prevent people from selling the drug in the same way that the war on drugs has been trying to keep the flow of it from coming in. And yet we're still the number one consumer in the world for all substances made and grown everywhere. And, the battle to keep it out just causes people to find ways to get it in. So it's a losing battle. But, in that same way of trying to scare people of, if you get caught, all it does is change the dynamic, like you said, of how people are using, making them more unsafe, more scared to be supportive, more scared to help each other out, which sounds like the opposite.
Yeah, again, I get the logic. Let's scare drug dealers. But when you sort of follow it to the next step, and you ask yourself what we're actually trying to achieve, These manslaughter charges, these drug-induced homicide charges, are not the way to accomplish what we want, which is to keep people alive.
I agree.
Well, I mean, I love your book. I really enjoyed it, and I really I love that you have so many of your articles on your website, on the Fighting for Space website. So, because you always write about things that challenge the way you think about a certain situation. I think that's what I find in people that are challenging those ideas of what's okay, like what's on the edge, the questions that we might think a little bit differently about if we were given more information. So I would encourage people to go on there and take a look at some of those articles, particularly the article that you did on May, but
And now when was that article?
I was just about to say, I love your book. I loved your book very much. I read it in a single sitting over a weekend, actually.
I couldn't put it down either. I didn't read it for a long time, and it's right here. I don't know if you can see it in the video. That
I can't.
He's got to leave it up there all the time now.
Well, I have, so I can keep pointing to it. Now, I'm so proud of it that I read it, because I don't read a lot of books, and so she got me, and I sat down and I did it in 2 quick sittings, just like you said. It was so, I just jumped right in. I couldn't stop. So
visceral. It was so honest, and I love that it proved a point that you mentioned earlier. If it takes somebody 15 tries to make it to abstinence, if it takes 15 overdoses, then we're going to give them 15 tries.
Yes.
Because, if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. Let's get them to abstinence.
My daughter is the face of that. 2 years she has now, and she's got a beautiful life and works and contributes to society and has and inspires other people. So it's, there's not a time limit on how much it takes as long as it takes.
Right.
And you
we
ask
don't put
any
time
mother,
limits on any other disease.
No, you ask any mother who's lost a child or almost lost a child if they're okay with somebody monitoring the person they love with because they're going to use anyhow in a safe way to make sure they don't die. I don't think you get too many arguments.
This was actually a big piece of the Insite story that I recount in Fighting for Space. I mentioned earlier that a lot of Americans ask me now, how do we bring a safe injection site to the United States? That was one of the reasons I wrote Fighting for Space. It's kind of like a how-to, an activist's guide for promoting harm reduction and establishing injection sites. And a big piece of that story, the Insite story in the late 90s, was exactly what you just said. It was mothers of children who were addicted to drugs telling politicians, my kid's out there, they're somewhere in that rough part of town looking for drugs. They're in a vacant apartment building, injecting drugs where no one's watching them. I want a safe injection site so that if I go to their room in the middle of the night and they've snuck out, I want a place where I can go and try and find them and ask if anybody's seen them. And today, this describes an awful situation, but it could be worse. Parents go to Insite looking for their children in the middle of the night, and they can find them there. I shouldn't say children because Insite is primarily an older population.
Yeah, but they're always children.
Of course, exactly. It was a part of a big piece of the Insite story was parents asking the government for an injection site, saying we want a nurse looking over their shoulder instead of a drug dealer, and we want them using drugs in a clean, sterile healthcare environment as opposed to a vacant somewhere.
Right. I mean,
the power of moms. That's what it is. Power of moms.
Nobody wants their child using drugs, but more so, you don't want your child to die, right? Because I personally believe that everybody would find some level of being well, whatever that is to that person, given enough time and support.
Here I'll mention that the most vocal group arguing in favor of a regulated supply of clean opiates is a national group in Canada called Moms Stop the Harm. And this is a group of mothers started in British Columbia and Alberta, which now has chapters right across the country, that's telling the federal government of Canada, if our kids are going to use drugs, we don't want them using fentanyl. Provide a regulated supply. It's mothers.
So that power of moms, like I know we have movements down here, Maureen. I know that you are connected with a lot of moms who are trying to create change and policy change, and it's working.
I mean, that's Magnolia. There's 25,000, mostly moms in those groups. Right. That's a strong lobby.
It is.
So, yeah. That's interesting. I'll have to look into that group. That's very interesting.
I mean, Moms Stop the Harm. They have a website. They're on social media. and their voice is loud and increasingly gaining traction across Canada.
Awesome.
I mean, don't get in between the mother and their child.
Bad idea. Bad idea.
And so now your book is available to our listeners everywhere.
Absolutely, Amazon.com. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and
exactly.
Okay, and you have a website here, fightingforspace.com.
Yeah, and there's links to where you can get it there. I don't mean to sort of promote myself here, but it was written sort of it's a chronological narrative that tells a story. But it was written as sort of a how-to guide. How was this accomplished in Vancouver? If I want to open a supervised injection site in my town, how do I do that?
Okay.
This is a roadmap.
Wow. So I would definitely, any of our listeners who are trying to do something or create some change in their own space, in their own town, that this would definitely be the book for them to read and maybe even gain some insight into the steps that they should take, correct?
I appreciate that. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've received great feedback. I know that Fighting for Space has been circulated around City Hall in Philadelphia, in Denver. Politicians from those cities have reached out to me. That's been some of the best feedback I've received, that it's actually reaching policymakers. And
wow.
I would also challenge people that disagree with this to read it. Open your mind up a little bit. And, before you, because I just keep seeing that people have a lot of ideas about this, but they don't they haven't looked into it enough. And they've formed all their opinions without the knowledge that it would require to really form an opinion. So you can still disagree, but at least open your mind up and read something that's very informative and well written and really very interesting.
Thank you.
Well, I'm always open to new things, and I bring with me in my own recovery, I bring a lot of preconceived notions, right? I bring, just like a lot of people do, I bring a lot of this isn't how we did it 50 years ago. This isn't how I got well. This isn't what worked for my loved one. And, I brought a lot of that with me, and it was really hard to let go of a lot of that. And I think, people like yourself writing books like this and sharing the facts, the data. I mean, just what I learned here today, which I love learning things on this podcast, but what I learned here today is that, there's a safe place for people to do something they're going to do in an unsafe way anyway. And there's a lower likelihood of them overdosing and passing away. And there's a better chance that by being there, they would have access to professionals that could get them another level of care if necessary. And that if they got well, they could come back to their family, to their loved ones, to their communities. They could become citizens, taxpayers. They could become politicians, musicians, the people that we cherish in our world right now. And, if it wasn't for things like that, then we would lose them. Maureen and I were just sharing a quote earlier that I pulled off of Facebook. And let's see if it's still there. It's not. I missed it. That's over. I won't be able to scroll and find it again. But it was very nice. And it talked about, if people that we knew had passed away before they became who we knew. Like, Malcolm X passed away at 20 years old. He was a totally different person. Like we would have lost that. Maya Angelou was the other one. Exactly. And so, these people that, these hundreds of people that are coming through and have a safe place to do this and are not passing away could be those people. Like these are people that we want to keep alive. And the numbers, like that's the piece that actually convinces me, is the numbers say it's working. If those people are staying alive, and even just one of those people goes on and gets well because they stayed alive, to me, that means it's working. If they're not out there causing harm in their family and their community, it means it's working. And it's hard to dispute those facts, even though I come with preconceived notions. So to Maureen's point, if you're listening and you don't agree, read the book, figure it out for yourself, look at the numbers, like
supervised injection sites, regulated supply. These ideas sound controversial, but learn about
scary.
them and acknowledge that they do sound scary. So let's learn about them. Let's talk about them. All we're trying to do with these ideas is keep people alive.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm really grateful. I appreciate you coming on. And, normally we ask people if they could change one thing, what would they change? And it sounds like I know your answer, but I'm going to ask anyway. If there was something about this industry or the way people approach this particular situation, what would you change?
At this point in 2019, we need to legalize and regulate drugs. And that's an idea that sounds scary. Like you just said, it absolutely does. Let's be honest about that. It sounds scary. Let's be honest that it's going to cause new problems, because it will cause new problems, but it will solve this immediate problem of 72,000 fatal overdoses in the United States last year alone, 64,000 the year before that. That's 130,000 people dead in 2 years. And legalization and regulation would solve that problem.
Mm-hmm.
It would create new challenges. I don't think we want Purdue Pharma in charge of our heroin supply. They don't have a great track record on that.
Yep.
So it's going to be complicated.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be hard. It's going to create problems, but it will solve this immediate problem of 72,000 overdoses a year, and we have to solve that problem.
Well, it's like, I mean, and that's a perfectly stated point is, you look at it, it has happened, it has gotten to this point, and it's broken. The way we deal with this thing is not correct. And if you think about the word solution, what is the solution to this? I agree with you. Ultimately, that's going to be the solution. It's the only way for us to change it, regulate it, treat it. In the meantime, I think what we're doing is we're very triage focused, very reactive. You know what I mean? There's a story. I can't even remember where I heard it now. I'm sure if I knew, I'd give them the credit. But you're standing by a river and you see all these people floating by in a river. And we're so caught up pulling people out of the river that we're not asking why they're jumping in the first place. We got to send someone back to go address that issue. And it's if we're looking at this.
That's a story I tell in Fighting for Space.
Is it really?
A different version of it. It's an old story that's been passed down through generations of Indigenous people in Canada.
Yeah.
But it's not quite the same story, but a different version of it that I discuss in the book as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's true. I mean, if we're so focused on treating what's right in front of us, we're not actually solving the problem, so to speak. And this idea that, it's a scary idea. It's terrifying. Like you just said, I hear it all the time. I talk about it. And when I talk about it, people are like, I can't believe you believe that. I'm like, well, sorry. It's just, if you're asking me what it's going to take to solve this, we're going to have to reopen the wound. We're going to have to stir the pot. Mm-hmm. People are going to get uncomfortable. People who've become set in their ways, businesses that have built their backs on the way the industry runs, the privatized prison industry, the war on drugs, the DEA, like a lot's going to change, and it would make some people really uncomfortable. And, I would love to see another place do it first so that the United States can be like, oh, look, it works. But I don't know. We'll see.
We can't wait any longer.
Yeah.
That's it right there.
Yeah. Well, we can all do what we can do. I mean, we have what we have. You have your book. We have our voice. We have our groups. We have our jobs. We have our position on the front lines doing what we can. And hopefully we make enough noise and people will listen to us. So.
That's all we can do, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Travis, for coming on. Really appreciate it. It's really good.
Thank you so much for having me. I really did love your book so much, and so it's wonderful to have this opportunity to chat with you guys.
Oh, thank you. Right back at you. Mike's got a great book, too. It's called Loving Lions. It's really very good. To read it. Yeah, it's really good.
Be in my Amazon cart today.
Yeah. Well, it was very nice to have you on. I really appreciate it. It was very nice to meet you. I know that you and Maureen had already met, but it was very nice to meet you and hear about your position, your book. We're going to make sure that our listeners have access to these links. Once again, that's fightingforspace.com, where they can find access to the book. And if they are on Twitter, it is T Lupick, correct? Lupick, T Lupick.
That's it.
And if they'd like to follow you, they just go right into Twitter and hit follow. Right?
Exactly. Thank you.
And well, hopefully we will chat again when the world changes and we can talk about how all of these ideas help fuel that. And in the meantime, thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
Bye.
All right. I would like to thank all of our listeners for joining us today on this episode of Collateral Damage. As always, if you'd like to find out all of the different ways that you can listen to and subscribe to our podcast, you can visit our website, which is www.cdpodcast.com. There are many different ways to listen, download, and subscribe, so we encourage you to choose the one that is most appropriate for you. And as always, we would encourage our listeners to get informed and stay connected. Thank you for joining us.